The HOA president just lost $847,000, 0 cents in property value, because she didn't know lakes have seasons. And wait until you hear what happened to the other 28 families who trusted her. Picture this. 29 luxury homes sitting pretty on the shore of Lake Sweetwater in East Texas. Karen Middleton, our HOA president, standing in her designer heels, telling everyone this was going to be the investment of a lifetime. Fast forward 8 months, and I'm watching her on live TV, knee-deep in floodwater, still insisting this is just a weather anomaly. But here's what she really didn't know, what none of these city folks bothered to ask. Lakes aren't swimming pools, they breathe. They rise and fall like clockwork, and if you don't respect that rhythm, Mother Nature will teach you the expensive way. Drop a comment if you've ever dealt with an HOAkaren who thought she could boss around the laws of physics. And before we dive into this beautiful disaster, where are you watching from? I bet your local lake doesn't flood McMansions every summer, like it's on a schedule. My name's Jake, and I never wanted to be the guy who had to say "I told you so" to 29 families losing their life savings. But sometimes the universe has other plans. I inherited my grandfather's place on Lake Sweetwater back in 2019. 40 acres of East Texas paradise. Well, paradise if you like the smell of cedar planks mixed with bass boat gasoline and the sound of mourning doves calling at dawn. The property came with a modest cabin built in 1943, a sturdy boat dock, and 200 feet of shoreline that my granddad had been taking care of since he came back from Korea. But the real treasure was Granddad's journals. 80 years of notes about weather patterns, fishing reports, and most importantly, water levels. Every spring, every summer, every flood, all written down in his careful handwriting. The man documented everything, including this little nugget I found on page 847. Summer of '98. Water rose 11 feet. Flooded Henderson's new place. Tried to warn him about building too close. Pride's expensive. See, Lake Sweetwater isn't your typical man-made reservoir. It's fed by underground springs and seasonal rainfall, which means it has moods. Winter drawdown reveals mudflats, old tree stumps, and the bones of forgotten foundations. You can walk out 50 yards from shore, hearing the crunch of dried cattails under your boots. But, come summer, those same mudflats turn into 8 to 12 feet of additional lake. They've been doing this dance for centuries. Enter Karen Middleton. Fresh divorce, insurance settlement burning a hole in her pocket, and a dream of turning sleepy Lake Sweetwater into her own little suburban paradise. She moved down from Dallas in 2020. Bought the development rights to the land across from my property, and immediately got herself elected HOA president of what she called Sweetwater Estates. Karen was the kind of woman who wore expensive perfume that somehow made the lake humidity smell worse. Every conversation with her felt like a job interview, where you were already rejected. She had this way of looking at locals like we were quaint little obstacles to her vision of progress. The first sign of trouble came 3 months after the development was complete. I was doing my usual dawn fishing routine, something Granddad and I had done together since I was 12, when I got served with a noise complaint. Apparently, starting my boat motor at 5:30 a.m. was disturbing the peace of the community. Then came the certified letters. My cabin was an eyesore that needed to be upgraded to neighborhood standards. My dock extended too far into their water. My truck was commercial-looking and violated the residential aesthetic covenant. This isn't some backwoods fishing hole anymore, Karen told me during our first face-to-face meeting. We have standards now, property values to maintain. I tried to be polite, explained the grandfather clause, the property rights, the fact that my family had been here since before her parents were born. Karen's response was to threaten legal action and suggest I might be more comfortable somewhere else. But here's the kicker. I realized Karen had no idea what she'd built her little empire on. Those luxury homes? Sitting pretty at exactly 18 inches above the current winter water level. I'd watched the construction, seen the foundation heights, and done the math. Come summer, when the lake rose to its historical levels, half those homes would be wading pools. I tried to warn her, politely, showed her granddad's journals, pointed out the high water marks on the old cypress trees. Karen dismissed me as jealous of progress and said modern engineering had solved those old problems. Bride's expensive, Granddad used to say. I was about to find out just how expensive. Karen wasn't the kind of woman who accepted being wrong gracefully, especially not from some backwoods fishing guide who lived in a cabin older than air conditioning. 2 weeks after I tried to warn her about the flooding, she launched her first real attack. A petition, signed by 15 homeowners, demanding the city force my property into compliance with community standards. But here's where Karen got clever. She claimed my shabby cabin was hurting everyone's property values, and the solution was to force me to build a seawall for flood protection. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a baseboat propeller. She presented this petition to the city planning department like she was doing everyone a favor. We need to think about our community's future, she told the planning commission. One property can't be allowed to drag down everyone else's investment. Time for my first counterpunch. I spent the next week in the city records office, which smells like old paper and broken dreams. What I found was beautiful. Karen's development had violated setback requirements by building within 150 feet of the historical high-water mark. I also discovered the original 1960s environmental impact study that specifically warned about seasonal flooding in that exact location. Here's a knowledge nugget for you. Texas Property Code Section 202.004 allows historical property rights to supersede HOA rules when there's a legitimate grandfather clause. Translation: if your property was there first and you're following historical usage patterns, the HOA can't force you to change just because they don't like how it looks. I filed a counter-complaint citing Karen's violations and environmental concerns, but Karen had connections. The city inspector who showed up at my place first was supposed to be impartial. Instead, I opened my door to find Tom Rodriguez, a weathered man in his 60s who'd been inspecting properties around the lake for 15 years. He took one look at me and grinned. "You're Bill's grandson," he said. "Your granddad saved my dad's boat in the '85 flood." Tom spent 2 hours examining my property, but what he was really doing was tracing the high water marks on my dock posts with his weathered hands. The wood still showed the stains from previous summer floods, like tree rings telling the lake's story. "These new folk have no idea what's coming," Tom whispered before he left. "Your granddad tried to warn the Henderson family in '98. Same spot, same mistake." But Karen discovered Tom and I knew each other. Within 48 hours, she'd filed an ethics complaint against him for bias toward local good old boy networks and demanded a new inspector without personal connections to the defendant. "It's obvious the corrupt system is protecting him," she announced at the next HOA meeting. "This is exactly the kind of cronyism that holds back progress." I found myself caught between wanting to laugh and wanting to shake some sense into her. "Lady, I'm trying to save your investment, not hurt it." But Karen was past listening. She'd made this personal. The night before the new inspector was scheduled to visit, I was going through more of Granddad's papers when I found a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1987. The headline read, "Summer floods destroy 12 homes at Sweetwater." The photo showed families evacuating by boat from the exact spot where Karen had built her dream community. I stared at that newspaper for a long time, smelling the musty scent of old newsprint, and realized this wasn't going to end with a simple property dispute. Karen had built a time bomb, and summer was coming. Karen escalated to legal warfare faster than lake water rises in a spring storm. The envelope arrived via certified mail on a Tuesday morning, thick enough to choke a catfish. Inside was a cease and desist letter from Hartwell Morrison and Associates, a Dallas law firm that charged more per hour than most folks around here make in a week. The letter accused me of harassment, defamation, and intentionally spreading false environmental claims to damage property values. The demand? $50,000 in damages for the harm my scare tactics had allegedly caused to the community's reputation. Oh, and I needed to publicly apologize and promise to stop interfering with the legitimate development and enjoyment of Sweetwater Estates. The kicker was the threat at the bottom. If the city didn't force me into compliance, Karen would sue them too for failing to protect citizens from harassment. Time to call in reinforcements. Dr. Sarah Chen from the Texas A&M Extension Office didn't just have flood data. She had a century's worth of geological surveys that made Karen's lawyers look like they were arguing with a calculator. Turns out FEMA flood maps get updated about as often as politicians tell the truth, which means they're often decades behind the actual science. Here's your knowledge nugget. FEMA flood maps are minimum standards, not maximum risk assessments. Local geological surveys and historical data provide much more accurate flood predictions than federal maps. Bottom line, always check local records before buying waterfront property, because the government map might be telling you yesterday's story. While I was building my defense file, Karen was busy turning the HOA into her personal surveillance state. 3 families had quietly approached me with concerns about flooding after seeing March rains raise the lake 2 feet above winter levels. Karen found out about these betrayals and called an emergency HOA meeting to address the traitors spreading unsubstantiated environmental panic. I wasn't invited to this meeting, but I had friends who were. The coffee was burnt. The folding chairs squeaked like angry geese, and Karen instituted fines for any homeowner caught spreading rumors that could damage community property values. The smell of fear was stronger than the burnt coffee. But Mother Nature doesn't care about HOA fines. March brought early rains, and the lake rose 2 feet above its winter level. My dock was still high and dry, built by a man who understood seasonal rhythms. Karen's community boat ramp? Half submerged, with families having to wade through ankle-deep water to reach their boats. Karen's explanation to her residents was a masterpiece of denial. This is obviously a one-time weather anomaly caused by poor city drainage management. Meanwhile, I started doing something Granddad had taught me: daily documentation. Every morning at sunrise, I'd photograph the water level from the same spot, measuring it against the permanent markers Granddad had installed decades ago. The sound of my camera shutter became as regular as the morning doves calling from the cypress trees. The photos told a story Karen didn't want anyone to read. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Karen had instructed her groundskeeping crew to remove the high water markers from the community areas. Those old concrete posts and metal plates that marked historical flood levels? Gone. She was literally erasing the evidence that might save her neighbors' homes. That's when the intimidation got personal. I came out of City Hall one afternoon to find all 4 of my truck tires slashed. The security footage was conveniently corrupted, but a witness saw Karen's college-age son and his buddies hanging around the parking lot about the time it happened. I filed a police report, but you know how these things go. Insufficient evidence, kids being kids, probably just vandalism. Karen was sending a message. But she didn't understand that some messages work both ways. The lake was 2 months away from summer levels, and I could already see water lapping at the edges of her community's landscaping. But Karen kept doubling down, telling her residents that modern engineering and positive thinking would solve any drainage issues. Granddad always said, the lake doesn't negotiate. I was about to find out if Karen was ready to learn that lesson the hard way. Karen decided to go political, which in small-town Texas means finding the right person to buy lunch for. Enter Councilman Bob Mitchell, a real estate developer who understood the language of campaign contributions and mutual back-scratching. Within a week of their first meeting, Bob proposed an emergency ordinance requiring aesthetic compliance for all lakefront properties. The genius of Karen's plan was in the details. The ordinance specifically targeted pre-1990 structures for immediate upgrade requirements, which meant every property except mine would be grandfathered in. My cabin, built in 1943, would need to meet modern building codes or face condemnation. The public hearing was scheduled with exactly 48 hours' notice, barely enough time for affected property owners to even find out about it, much less organize a response. But Karen underestimated the power of church networks and VFW connections. I made some calls. By Thursday evening, I had 43 locals committed to showing up at Friday's hearing, including Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd lived on the lake since 1962 and had photo albums that told stories Karen didn't want heard. My lawyer cousin Jimmy, who took the case pro bono because he enjoys watching bullies get their comeuppance, filed a procedural objection. Here's another knowledge nugget. The Texas Open Meeting Act requires adequate notice for public hearings affecting property rights, and 48 hours might not meet the legal standard, especially for ordinances targeting specific properties. The takeaway: when local government tries to rush through property restrictions, they often cut legal corners you can challenge. The hearing was held in the community center, under buzzing fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly green. The air conditioning was broken, so the room smelled like nervous sweat and burnt coffee from a pot that had been cooking since dawn. Karen showed up in a business suit with a PowerPoint presentation titled "Building Our Community's Future." 47 slides about property values, economic development, and the need for consistent standards that reflect our shared vision. When my turn came, I stood up with Granddad's journals, historical photos, and Dr. Chen's flood data. No PowerPoint, no fancy graphics, just facts and pictures that showed what Karen's shared vision was built on top of. That's when Mrs. Rodriguez stood up, 84 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and carrying a photo album that weighed more than she did. She walked to the front of the room, opened that album, and held up a picture of the 1987 flood. The photo showed water reaching the second story of homes built in the exact location where Karen's development now sat. "My husband tried to warn them," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "They called us backwards and said we didn't understand modern construction." Karen's response was predictable. That was completely different circumstances. Modern engineering and drainage systems prevent those problems from occurring today. But I had one more card to play. "Mrs. Middleton," I said, "can you tell the city council whether your development has flood insurance?" The silence stretched like taffy. Karen's face went through several colors before settling on a shade that matched the broken air conditioning. That's not relevant to this hearing," she finally managed. "Actually, it is," Jimmy said, standing up with a folder full of insurance documents. "Because flood insurance has a 30-day waiting period, and it can't be purchased after a flood warning has been issued. Here's your third knowledge nugget. Flood insurance isn't just a good idea for waterfront property. It's often required by mortgage companies, but only if they know about flood risk. If sellers misrepresent flood history, buyers can get stuck without coverage when they need it most. Always verify flood insurance availability and cost before closing on waterfront property." You could hear the whispered conversations starting around the room, as HOA families realized they might not be covered for the kind of flooding I was predicting. The city council tabled the ordinance pending an environmental review, which was politicians speak for "we're not touching this mess with a 10-foot pole." Karen was furious. "You're terrorizing innocent homeowners with scare tactics. she accused me after the meeting. These families trusted me to protect their investment, and you're trying to destroy that trust with fear-mongering. Ma'am, I replied, I'm trying to help them protect their investment. There's a difference. But 3 families approached me quietly in the parking lot, asking about flood insurance and how to prepare for potential water damage. Karen had forbidden HOA residents from cooperating with me, but fear is stronger than HOA rules. Summer was 6 weeks away and the lake was already 3 feet above winter levels. Karen's community was about to get a crash course in seasonal hydrology, whether they wanted one or not. Jimmy's law degree might have been from a state school, but his skills at reading public records were pure gold. He'd been digging through the development's financing documents when he found the smoking gun that changed everything. Karen hadn't just made a mistake about flood risk. She'd personally guaranteed a $2,300,000 0-cent construction loan using property valuations that assumed permanent low water levels. The loan documents were brutal in their clarity. The appraisals were based on lakefront recreational property with stable seasonal water access. If the homes experienced significant flooding, the loan would become immediately callable due to material misrepresentation of environmental conditions. But it got worse. Karen had refinanced her own home to cover the HOA's legal fees and the elaborate landscaping that was supposed to make Sweetwater Estates look like a resort. She'd also been using HOA dues to pay her personal legal expenses. About $23,000, 0 cents over 18 months. Here's a knowledge nugget that every HOA member should tattoo on their brain. HOA board members are personally liable for misuse of association funds, and using community money for personal legal bills is embezzlement. Criminal charges, asset seizure, and personal bankruptcy are all on the table when board members play fast and loose with other people's money. Suddenly, Karen's behavior made perfect sense. She wasn't just wrong about the flooding, she was financially desperate. If those homes flooded, she'd lose everything. Her house, her investment, and probably her freedom. The realization hit me like a cold splash of lake water. Karen was trapped in a corner of her own making, and trapped animals do unpredictable things. She started pushing the city to build an emergency levy system that would cost taxpayers $890,000 0 cents. At city council meetings, her voice got higher and more frantic as she described the environmental emergency that required immediate action. She even started blaming me for creating the flood risk through negative energy and sabotaging the community's success. The smell of desperation was stronger than marsh gas on a hot day. April brought heavy rains, and the lake rose 4 feet above winter level. Karen's community experienced their first real taste of what was coming. Soggy lawns, flooded garages, and the constant hum of sump pumps running 24 hours a day. Karen hired emergency pumping services and told residents it was a temporary drainage issue that would be resolved once the city fixed their inadequate infrastructure. But I had a choice to make. I could expose Karen's financial crimes right now, destroy her completely, and watch her take 28 innocent families down with her. Or I could try to find a solution that held Karen accountable while protecting the people who'd trusted her. Granddad's voice echoed in my memory. Help your neighbors, even when they don't deserve it. I started reaching out to flood remediation companies for cost estimates, researching emergency relocation resources, and quietly contacting my old military buddy Marcus, who now worked for the local TV station. If I was going to save Karen's victims, I needed to be ready for the inevitable disaster. Time-lapse photography doesn't lie. My daily photos showed the water creeping steadily higher, following the same pattern Granddad had documented for 80 years. Karen could hire all the lawyers and pumps she wanted, but you can't sue physics. Summer flood season was 6 weeks away, and Karen was about to learn that Mother Nature doesn't negotiate payment plans. War might be hell, but planning for it requires the precision of a Swiss watch and the patience of a saint. My kitchen table became mission control, covered with flood charts, legal documents, and coffee rings from too many late-night strategy sessions. Dr. Sarah Chen agreed to provide expert testimony about historical flood patterns. Tom Rodriguez, despite Karen's complaints, helped gather 80 years of flood documentation from city records. Jimmy mapped out the legal strategy for protecting the HOA families from Karen's fraud. Mrs. Rodriguez became my liaison to the other long-term residents, folks who remembered when the lake showed its teeth. The sound of papers rustling mixed with the coffee percolating and rain drumming on the windows as we planned for what was coming. The legal strategy had 3 parts. First, Texas Deceptive Trade Practices Act allows homeowners to sue developers for misrepresenting property conditions, like claiming lakefront homes would never flood. Second, HOA board insurance might cover legal defense costs, but it won't cover criminal restitution or personal asset seizure. Third, environmental disclosure laws require sellers to reveal known flood risks, and Karen's emails proved she knew about the danger. Here's your knowledge nugget. If you're buying property from someone who seems desperate to close quickly or discourage inspections, run a title search and environmental history check yourself. Desperate sellers sometimes hide expensive problems, and as-is sales can leave you holding the bag for someone else's mistakes. The plan was elegant. Force Karen to admit the flood risk publicly, which would trigger insurance claims and buyer protection laws, while creating legal liability that protected the families she'd deceived. Marcus, my TV journalist buddy, agreed to document the flood season with hidden cameras at key monitoring points. We prepared B-roll footage of historical floods and expert interviews, letting Karen's denials create dramatic contrast with the inevitable reality. But I wasn't just planning to expose Karen. I was planning to save her victims. I organized a flood preparedness workshop without mentioning the HOA specifically, taught sandbagging techniques, emergency evacuation procedures, and insurance claims processes. 12 HOA families attended, despite Karen's prohibition against cooperating with me. Another knowledge nugget: FEMA disaster aid only kicks in after a federal disaster declaration, which can take weeks. Private flood insurance pays claims much faster, but you need to file properly, with detailed documentation and photos taken within 72 hours of damage. I installed water level monitoring equipment with a live web camera, creating a simple website called Sweetwater Lake Flood History that documented daily water levels with photos and measurements. The click of my waterproof camera housing and the splash of water against the measuring stick became my morning routine. Karen tried to counter my preparations by hiring an engineering firm to design a flood mitigation system and proposing a special tax district to fund a $1,200,000 0-cents levy project. But the engineering firm discovered the same flood data I'd found, and quietly withdrew from the project after realizing Karen had misrepresented the site conditions. That's when 3 HOA board members secretly approached me with documentation of Karen's financial irregularities. They'd discovered $23,000, 0 cents, in personal expenses charged to HOA accounts over 18 months, and were planning to call an emergency board meeting to remove Karen from the presidency. May brought unusually heavy rainfall, and the lake rose 6 feet above winter level. Karen's development experienced significant flooding for the first time. 8 homes with first-floor water damage, the constant sound of sump pumps, and the smell of damp carpet and mold beginning to take hold. Karen blamed unprecedented weather and faulty city infrastructure, but her residents were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about flood insurance and property values. I coordinated with emergency services for summer flood response, prepared legal documents for immediate filing when Karen's fraud became undeniable, and shared evacuation plans with families willing to listen. The pieces were in place. Karen had painted herself into a corner with lies and embezzlement, but she still had 6 weeks to come clean and help her residents prepare. 6 weeks to choose between admitting her mistakes and watching her neighbors lose everything. Knowing Karen, I wasn't optimistic about her making the right choice. Desperation makes people do stupid things, and Karen was getting more desperate by the day. She hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on me, hoping to find something that would discredit my flood warnings. The PI was about as subtle as a bass boat in a bathtub. I could hear his telephoto lens clicking from across the lake, while he photographed me doing normal property maintenance. Karen also tried to have my military disability benefits investigated for fraud, claiming I was too functional to deserve compensation. She didn't understand that PTSD doesn't mean you can't operate equipment or read water levels. But her ignorance was becoming dangerous. The harassment escalated when my trail cameras caught Karen's son and his college buddies vandalizing my flood monitoring equipment. They thought they were being clever, but motion-activated cameras with night vision don't care about your opinion of property rights. Meanwhile, the lake was rising toward its historical summer peak, and Karen's development was running out of time and dry ground. Late May brought the lake to 8 feet above winter level, which put 15 HOA homes with standing water in basements and garages. The smell of mold was competing with the scent of expensive landscaping, and the sound of industrial pumps ran around the clock. Karen's hired emergency pumping services at $8,000 per week of HOA expense, telling residents that the flooding was obviously caused by Jake's illegal modifications to the lake bottom. The woman was so committed to denial that she'd started blaming me for controlling the weather. I kept documenting everything, the vandalism, the water levels, the property damage, while coordinating with insurance adjusters to help HOA families file claims quickly. The trick with flood damage is documentation within 72 hours for maximum coverage, and Karen was actively discouraging her residents from filing claims because it would admit flood risk and hurt everyone's property values. 8 families defied Karen and filed insurance claims anyway. The sound of cardboard boxes being packed and whispered phone calls planning evacuations became the background music of Sweetwater Estates. Karen's smear campaign reached new levels of crazy when she appeared on the local radio station claiming I was an environmental terrorist who was manipulating weather data and profiting from others' misery. The radio host was Marcus, my journalist buddy, who let Karen hang herself with increasingly outrageous claims. The audio went viral on local Facebook groups, with Karen insisting I had military weather control technology and was causing the floods through negative energy projection. Her lawyers filed a restraining order claiming I was harassing HOA residents by offering flood insurance advice and emergency evacuation assistance. The order prohibited me from interfering with community flood mitigation efforts, which apparently included warning people about rising water. Here's another knowledge nugget. Restraining orders require evidence of credible threat to be legally valid. Environmental warnings and public safety information don't qualify as harassment, even if the recipient doesn't like the message. Courts generally protect speech about public safety issues. Jimmy filed a counter motion with evidence of Karen's embezzlement and a request for sanctions against her lawyers for filing frivolous legal actions. The breaking point came when 3 more HOA board members resigned, citing Karen's erratic leadership and financial irregularities. Karen called an emergency meeting to reorganize the board with her supporters, but only 4 of 29 homeowners attended, not enough for a legal quorum. I didn't sign up to watch my neighbors lose their homes for one person's ego, one of the resigned board members told the local newspaper. Karen was isolated, desperate, and facing criminal charges. The lake was 2 weeks away from peak flood season, and her community was about to learn why Granddad always said, "The lake doesn't care about your politics." Desperate people make desperate offers, and Karen's final gambit was a doozy. She approached me privately with a briefcase containing $75,000, 0 cents in cash, claiming it was from a community fund to help me relocate for everyone's benefit. She wanted me to disappear, stop interfering, and let her handle the flooding situation without my negative influence. What Karen didn't know was that I was wearing a wire provided by the police, who'd been investigating her embezzlement for 2 weeks. Her bribery attempt was recorded in crystal-clear digital audio, including her confession that she'd been borrowing HOA funds and falsifying flood risk disclosures to protect property values. "Look, we both know this flooding thing is overblown," she said, pushing the briefcase across my kitchen table. "Take the money, buy something nice up north, and let the community move forward without all this drama." The woman was offering me stolen money to stop warning her neighbors about a flood that was already happening. June 1st arrived like a natural disaster with a calendar appointment. The lake reached its historical summer peak at 10.5 feet above winter level, which put 23 of 29 HOA homes under significant flood damage. Karen's own house had water reaching the first-floor windows, but she was still standing in knee-deep lake water, telling news cameras this was a temporary weather anomaly caused by climate change and poor government infrastructure. Marcus's TV station was broadcasting live from the flooded development, and the footage was surreal. Luxury homes sitting in what looked like a shallow lake, with boat motors running where SUVs used to park. The sound of helicopter news crews mixed with the smell of lake water and sewage backup from overwhelmed septic systems. But the viral moment came when Karen slipped and fell face first into the floodwater, while insisting on live television that there was no flood risk at Sweetwater Estates. The video got 2.3 million views in 48 hours, launching 1,000 memes about Flood Karen. Karen's psychological breakdown accelerated after the video went viral. She barricaded herself in her flooded home, refusing evacuation orders and threatening suicide if the harassment didn't stop. Police and social services intervened for a wellness check, which led to them discovering evidence of her embezzlement during the safety inspection. The community crisis was devastating. 18 families evacuated to emergency shelters. $2,100,000 0 cents in flood damage across the development, and insurance companies beginning to rescind policies for material misrepresentation of flood risk. Here's your final knowledge nugget. Homeowners can sue HOA boards for failure to disclose known environmental risks, especially when board members had access to historical data that contradicted their public statements. If your HOA claims something is impossible when historical records show it's inevitable, document everything and lawyer up. While Karen was having her breakdown, I opened my property as an evacuation center and boat launch for rescue operations. My military experience came in handy for coordinating emergency response, and the sound of boat motors rescuing families mixed with the smell of coffee brewing for evacuees. I refused all media interviews, focusing on helping neighbors who'd been betrayed by someone they trusted. The legal avalanche was swift and merciless. The district attorney filed criminal charges against Karen for embezzlement and fraud. 22 homeowners filed a class action lawsuit against Karen and the HOA board. The Environmental Protection Agency opened an investigation into illegal development in federally protected flood zones. Personal liability insurance doesn't cover criminal acts, which meant Karen's personal assets were on the chopping block for victim restitution. The city scheduled an emergency town hall meeting for flood response planning, and Karen posted bail with her last remaining assets, planning to attend the meeting to clear her name and blame everyone else for the disaster she'd created. I prepared my final evidence presentation, knowing this would be Karen's last chance to accept responsibility before the full weight of her choices crushed what remained of her life. The showdown was set for Thursday night, with media from 3 states planning to cover what had become a national story about HOA abuse and environmental fraud. Karen had one final opportunity to tell the truth. Based on everything I'd seen, she was going to waste it spectacularly. The community center held 300 people, but it felt like the whole world was watching. TV cameras from 4 news stations lined the back wall, with live streams broadcasting to social media platforms where HOAkaren was trending nationally. The buzz of conversation mixed with the squeak of folding chairs and the rapid-fire clicking of camera shutters as reporters documented every moment. Mayor Patterson, the full city council, County Sheriff Martinez, and an EPA representative sat at the main table, all looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. The air conditioning was working overtime, but you could still smell the nervous sweat of 300 people waiting for a reckoning. Karen arrived in a designer's suit, despite being out on bail for embezzlement, walking through the crowd like she was entering a boardroom instead of her own trial by public opinion. She'd prepared a PowerPoint presentation titled, "The Truth About Sweetwater, Overcoming Sabotage and Misinformation." "I'm the real victim here," Karen announced, clicking through slides that blamed the flooding on unusual weather patterns, inadequate city infrastructure, and one man's campaign of environmental terrorism. She claimed she'd invested my life savings to build a beautiful community, and this disturbed individual has destroyed it with lies and manipulation. The audience was stone silent as Karen presented charts, showing how the flooding was obviously caused by everything except the lake doing what it had done for centuries. When my turn came, I stood up calmly with Granddad's journals, historical photos, and Dr. Chen's scientific data. No PowerPoint, no fancy graphics. Just 80 years of documentation that told the truth Karen had been denying. I showed the time-lapse video of predictable seasonal flooding, the historical high water marks on old cypress trees, and the newspaper clippings from previous floods in the exact same location. Then came the first mic drop moment. "Mrs. Middleton," I said, holding up printed emails. "These are communications between you and your lawyer from 8 months ago, discussing flood risk at your development. Would you like me to read the part where your attorney warns you about seasonal water level fluctuations that could impact ground floor structures?" The audible gasp from the audience was like a collective punch to the gut. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as reporters captured Karen's face, cycling through shock, anger, and panic. Dr. Chen stood up next, presenting scientific data showing the development was built directly in a 50-year flood zone. Mrs. Rodriguez followed, with her 1987 photos of identical flooding at the same location. Her voice steady as she described watching families evacuate by boat from the exact spot where Karen's McMansions now sat. The second mic drop moment came when I played the recording of Karen's bribery attempt. "I'll pay you $75,000, 0 cents, to disappear and stop telling people about floods." Karen's voice echoed through the speakers, clear as lake water. "We both know this flooding thing is overblown. Take the money and let the community move forward without all this drama." The crowd erupted in angry murmurs. Several HOA residents stood up, pointing at Karen and shouting about their destroyed homes and life savings. Karen's response was to completely lose her composure. She interrupted the proceedings, screaming about fake evidence and a conspiracy between corrupt officials and a mentally unstable veteran. She accused me of causing the flood with negative energy and claimed the recordings were manufactured by military mind control technology. The audience started laughing. Not polite chuckles, but full-blown laughter at the absurdity of a woman claiming I controlled the weather through negative energy. Karen didn't realize how unhinged she sounded. "You're all being manipulated," she shrieked, pointing wildly around the room. "He's using psychological warfare techniques to make you believe his lies." The EPA representative stood up, cutting through Karen's meltdown with bureaucratic precision. "Mrs. Middleton, we're announcing an emergency investigation into fraudulent development permits and environmental violations. Federal flood zone violations carry penalties up to $250,000, 0 cents, per structure." Sheriff Martinez served Karen with additional warrants live on camera: fraud, conspiracy, and criminal misrepresentation of environmental hazards. The handcuffs clicking shut was audible in the sudden silence. But the third and final mic drop moment belonged to someone I'd never expected. A man in a business suit stood up in the back of the room. "Mrs. Middleton, I'm representing Lakeside Mutual Insurance. We're here to formally notify you that all policies for Sweetwater Estates are being canceled immediately for material misrepresentation of flood risk." The crowd went dead silent. "You submitted sworn statements that no flood risks existed at this location," he continued. "Our investigation shows you had documented knowledge of seasonal flooding dating back decades. Your policies are void, and we're pursuing restitution for fraudulent claims." Karen pointed a shaking finger at me. "You've destroyed 29 families. Because you're jealous of success. You couldn't stand to see progress in your backwards little world." I stood up slowly, the room so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. "Ma'am, I tried to save those families. You destroyed them because you wouldn't listen." The silence stretched like a held breath. Then Karen stormed toward the exit, screaming about lawsuits and persecution, her designer heels clicking frantically on the linoleum floor. She made it exactly 3 steps before slipping on a wet spot and falling flat on her face in front of every camera in the room. The footage of HOAkaren's final tantrum and pratfall went viral within 2 hours, watched by millions of people who finally got to see a corrupt HOA president get exactly what she deserved. Justice moves slowly, but it moves. Karen was arrested on additional fraud charges and held without bail as a flight risk. 22 families received emergency FEMA assistance for temporary housing while they figured out how to rebuild their lives from the wreckage of Karen's lies. My property became the official evacuation center and flood monitoring station, with the sound of construction crews demolishing flood-damaged homes mixing with the everyday sounds of a lake community learning to heal. The legal resolution was swift and decisive. Karen pleaded guilty to embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy charges, receiving 4 years in prison plus $1,800,000, 0 cents in restitution to her victims. The homeowner's successful lawsuit established legal precedent for HOA board liability in environmental misrepresentation cases. The civil settlement required Karen to forfeit all assets, including her flooded mansion, to compensate the families she'd deceived. 18 families chose to rebuild with flood-resistant designs, proper elevation, and comprehensive flood insurance. 4 families relocated, but received full compensation from the restitution fund. The new HOA board: "I decline the presidency, thank you very much," implements transparent governance and mandatory flood risk disclosure for all property sales. The community transformation was remarkable. What started as a disaster became a model for environmental responsibility and neighbor-helping-neighbor cooperation. The city implemented stricter flood zone enforcement that prevents future fraud, and real estate agents now have to provide historical flood data with every lakefront property listing. I found my calling as the community's unofficial flood coordinator, partnering with Texas A&M to establish a permanent lake monitoring station. The sound of students measuring water levels and the laughter of children playing at the new community dock replaced the chaos of Karen's manufactured crisis. Granddad's Cabin became a research center for seasonal lake management, with scientists and students learning from 80 years of documented weather patterns. The old man would have loved seeing his careful observations help protect future generations from the kind of disaster Karen created. The community established the Sweetwater Flood Preparedness Scholarship for environmental engineering students and started an annual Lake Stewardship Festival that brings together old-timers and newcomers to share knowledge about living with water. Mrs. Rodriguez became the festival director, finally getting the respect she deserved for her decades of environmental wisdom. I met Sarah, Dr. Chen's research assistant, during the ongoing lake studies, and we've found something beautiful in combining military service ethics with environmental stewardship. My PTSD symptoms have improved significantly through community service and having a purpose beyond my own survival. The story inspired state legislation requiring flood risk disclosure for all HOA developments. Here's your final knowledge nugget. Texas Property Code now requires 100-year flood history disclosure for lakefront property sales, so future buyers can't be blindsided like Karen's victims were. The law is called the Sweetwater Protection Act, and it's already preventing similar disasters across the state. Karen's prison letters reveal she still blames me for ruining her American dream, but I don't respond to them. Instead, I donate them to the local journalism school as a case study in how ego and greed can destroy communities. The irony is perfect. Karen's former mansion site is now a wetland preserve after the city purchased it for environmental protection. The lake teaches patience, Granddad used to say. Sometimes people need to learn the hard way that you can't fight Mother Nature and win. But when communities come together to face reality instead of running from it, beautiful things can happen. Last summer, when the lake rose to its seasonal peak, every family was prepared. Proper elevation, flood insurance, evacuation plans, and the knowledge that comes from respecting natural cycles instead of fighting them. Zero flood damage, zero panic, and zero HOA presidents claiming to control the weather. The sound of lake water, lapping peacefully at properly elevated docks, is the sweetest music you'll ever hear. So drop a comment with your worst HOA horror story. Some of you have Karen stories that make this look tame, and I want to hear them. The more we share these experiences, the better we can protect each other from the petty tyrants who think they can boss around physics. And since you made it this far, hit that subscribe button, because next week we're covering the HOA president who tried to ban vegetable gardens. Didn't know her neighbor was a Supreme Court justice's wife. Trust me, that karma delivery was even more satisfying than watching Karen slip and fall on live TV. Final numbers. Karen lost $847,000 in personal assets. The community received $2,300,000 in federal flood recovery funds, and proper preparation has prevented an estimated $15 million in future flood losses. The Lake Monitoring Station continues to protect families from both natural disasters and the human-made disasters that come from ignoring inconvenient truths. Remember, folks, lakes have seasons. HOA presidents don't control weather, and Mother Nature always collects her debts with interest.